Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here once again with the next chapter of this book collecting game by A. Edward Newton, contained in this volume here. And this is the fifth video in my read-along series of this particular work. As you may know, Sean D. Standfast is reading aloud from the Amenities of Book Collecting, also by A. Edward Newton on the days that I am not reading aloud from this book collecting game. So we are on chapter 5 today, and chapter 5 is called The Book Itself. It may be supposed that anyone concerned with this volume knows that what are called books today were originally rolls, hence the Rolls or Records Office. But if anyone will read or attempt to read a roll and then a book, he will see what an improvement upon a roll the book is. Books were originally of parchment, then of vellum, and there is a small difference between the two, and then of paper. Volumes have been written about the discovery of and the art of making paper, and then came the art of printing from movable metal types. It has recently been shown in an excellent book, The Invention of Printing in China by Thomas Francis Carter of Columbia University, that the art of printing was known in China much earlier than in Europe, but of general consent, Gutenberg is accredited with the art of printing as we know it, about 1450. Anyway, we will start there with the Gutenberg Bible. Every time one of these great books comes upon the market, there is a great furore. The last one to be sold at auction was the Melt copy, which at the Anderson Galleries in New York on February 15, 1926, brought the record price of $106,000. Dr. Rosenbach paid it and immediately sold the volume to Mrs. Harkness, who presented it to Yale University. It was a noble gift. One peculiarity of this great book is that it has neither a colophon nor a title page. Both of these important developments in the printed book came later. If I were asked what a colophon is and how it came to get its name, I should reply that a colophon is a note either printed or written on the last page of a book, giving the title of the book, sometimes the name of the author or printer, and the date or place of publication. In brief, very much information as one now finds or expects to find upon a title page. Occasionally the word Alleluia is added, suggesting thankfulness that the job is completed. It gets its name from an ancient city in Asia Minor, where it is claimed. Homer was born. It was, in its day, governed by a rich aristocracy which provided a famous troop of horse that was kept to make the final and most important charge in battle. Hence it is the last or final piece of writing or printing in a book. The colophon is one of the many subjects on which Alfred W. Pollard, former keeper of the printed books in the British Museum, has written learnedly. It requires only a moment's thought to realize the importance of the colophon and the title page, and anyone who has observed the fate of any large book knocking about the house, a Bible, a dictionary, a directory, even a telephone book, will understand how easy it is for a big, heavy book to lose its first and last pages. Such has always been the fate of heavy books throughout the ages. This sometimes makes it difficult to tell at a glance what the book is. We think we live in a progressive age, and we do. With the awakening of the world after the so-called Dark Ages, the discovery of the art of printing and the discovery of America gave the world a tremendous fillip. The art of printing swept over Europe like wildfire. In Germany, Italy, France, and the Low Countries, the urge to print was enormous. Only England was backward, for a reason which will presently be explained. Types were cut and cast and set in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, besides the languages common in the countries in which the books were produced. It is computed that in less than 50 years, by 1500 to be exact, about 38,000 separate books or editions had been produced. These books were called incunabula. This is a plural Latin noun meaning variously cradle or birthplace, hence the beginning of everything. It is a generally recognized European word, although the French word incunables, meaning the same thing, is now coming into use. Having in mind its original meaning, it should perhaps have been limited to books printed in any or all countries, before 1475, say, but the habit of speaking in round numbers prevailed, and it is understood to refer to any book printed before the year 1500. The most important book on the subject of incunabula is a great bibliography in Latin, first published a century ago in Stuttgart by Ludwig Hane. About 16,000 books or editions are mentioned by him, and there is a supplement listing 7,000 additional titles. One frequently sees this work referred to in old book catalogues as mentioned or not mentioned by Hayne. An asterisk before the title means that Hayne has personally seen the volume referred to. An entirely new work on this subject, undertaken with the approval of the German government, but suspended by the World War, is again going forward. Very frequently, incunabula have no title page or colophon, and give no information as to what the book is, or when, where, or by whom it was printed. Hence the extreme difficulty of dealing with the subject. But scholars are able to determine much by careful study of the types employed and close observation of the watermarks in the paper. England was slow to make use of the discovery of the art of printing, but this should not be understood as implying any lack of interest or scholarship in Britain. For the great books of the world were printed in Greek or Latin, which were then what might be called universal languages, while the Italian, French, German, and English languages were but little known outside their respective countries, and in many cases not too well in them. French was the language of the court and the law courts in England until well into the 14th century, and traces of Old French survive in our own law courts to this day. Caxton printed the first book in the English language, if English is to be called. The Record of the Histories of Troy in Burgess in 1471, and his second book, the first was an illustration, The Game and Play of Chess, not long after. His first book printed in England, the Dictes and the Sayings of the Philosophers, were printed at Westminster in 1477. This was the first English book with a colophon, and the copy in the Rylands Library in Manchester supplies the month and the day. It was the 18th of November. The Record of the Histories of Troy and other specimens at Caxton's printing, while fascinating to the English or American collector, are distinctly inferior as examples of printing to the work of the continental presses. As late as 1539, when a great Bible was desired in English, it was printed or at least begun in Paris, while the first complete English Bible was printed by Froschover at Zurich in Switzerland in 1535. And we do have here a reproduction of a page from Caxton's Game and Play of Chess, the first English book with an illustration. That's it right there. In a book intended for the use of one who is beginning to collect books or who is willing to read about them, it is hardly worthwhile to spend much time over how to tell a Caxton. We are not likely to run across Caxtons except in the vault of the brothers Rosenbach in New York, and then we can tell them by the price. Nor shall I devote much time to incunabula in general. The Catholic collector may wish to have a few examples of early printing, and it is still possible to secure good examples of Bibles, prayer books, and the like, without totally wrecking one's bank account. But the modern collector gets a very slight thrill over a medieval treatise on theology, jurisprudence, philosophy, and philology. Indeed, his opinions on these subjects are not fit to print, and it is with these subjects that the earliest books chiefly concern themselves. Today we devote our attention to what may be called human interest, books written for and read by men not very unlike ourselves. 100 years ago, this book collecting game was played in a very different manner. It was then almost exclusively the recreation of a gentleman, and a gentleman might be described as one who had no steady occupation. He probably had had a classical education and read Latin and Greek with comparative ease, and he would have thought it beneath his dignity to devote very much time or thought to a book printed in English, except to Caxton's and those of his immediate successors. Reader, have you, perchance, a copy of Gibbon's Bibliographical Decameron on hand? It is a magnificent book in 3 volumes, usually finely bound in old, straight-grained red morocco, and it was once a book which no gentleman's library should be without. Today it is not a plug, but very nearly. The text itself is unreadable, but the notes in fine print, and chiefly in volume 3, give the book such vitality as it has. Turn to page 49 and read the long account of the Roxburgh fight, as it pleases the would-be fastidious author to call the Roxburgh Sale, one of the greatest sales in the history of book collecting. It would be a pious thing for someone to lift this story from out of the immense amount of verbiage in which it is embedded and print it in a pamphlet in type, which can be read by the naked eye. The sale took place in the dining room of John, late Duke of Roxburgh, on the north side of St. James Square. Gibbon describes the events of the great day, June 17, 1812, as though he were an eyewitness of a battle, which indeed it was. The star item was a Boccaccio of 1471. Two great nobles contended for the prize. The bidding began by a gentleman from the country, bidding 100 guineas. Someone said 500, Earl Spencer made it 1,000, and the Marquis of Blandford added 10. To every bid made by Earl Spencer, the noble Marquis added imperturbably 10, until the amazing sum of 2,250 guineas is bid by the Earl, to which is added the usual 10 of the Marquis, and the hammer falls. Whereupon the noble Earl says, "I bow to you," and retires. "We are friends still," remarks Blandford, extending his hand. "Perfectly," says the defeated Earl. "This was a great game, played by giants. But my point is this. Not a man present at that sale could by the utmost stretch of his imagination comprehend how any very keen bibliographical interest could be aroused by a Shakespeare folio or a quarto, yet today such a price as the famous Boccaccio fetched is paid at every important auction sale for items then entirely neglected. I have been led into a digression. To return to the printed book, the quick perfection of the type, ink, paper, and all that we mean by the word format of the early book is bewildering to one who has watched the development of other arts and sciences. The colophon soon gave way to the title page, and the earliest book in English with a title page is said to be a passing gaudy little book necessary and behovul against the pestilence. It was printed about 1486 by William de Matutina, a contemporary of Caxton. In due course, the title page developed. Woodcut borders came into use, in the center of which was the printed title, and then perhaps the printer's device. Some of these devices were very beautiful, and remain unsurpassed to the present time. These printer's marks were originally placed on the last page of the book under the colophon. Subsequently, they appeared as an ornament below the title of the book on the title page, where they have ever since remained. After a time, it was discovered that large mortised frames or borders made of wood easily became warped or broken, and these then gave way to engravings on copper. And from these engraved title pages, it was only another step, and a logical one, to the engraved frontispiece. Early in the 16th century, such great masters as Durer and Holbein did not think it beneath their dignity to design borders for title pages. The title of the great Bible of Henry VIII is said to be a design of the latter, and it is generally conceded that the engraved titles, reaching the height of excellence at the Plantin Morris Press at Antwerp. To the book lover, this wonderful old printing establishment, still preserved, and now a public museum, is one of the most interesting places in the world. But one cannot always believe what one sees on a title page. Early editors and printers were often in peril of their lives. Authority did not look kindly on the dissemination of learning. It preferred to tell the common people what they should believe, and so, for one reason or another, fictitious names were not infrequently employed to disguise real ones. The so-called Matthew's Bible was really the work of John Rogers, who persisted nevertheless during the reign of Queen Mary, and printed in Paradise, and to be bought where it is sold. It appears on the title of a book printed during the period of the Commonwealth. In the early days of bookmaking, designs for title pages and portraits were used over and over again. Any effigy of a man with a fine crop of whiskers would serve as the portrait of a philosopher, and such cuts were used many times over various names, not infrequently in the same volume. My attention was kindly drawn to an unknown correspondent in the city of Mexico, to the fact that the border design for the title page of the Edward Prayer Book, 1549, was deemed suitable for at least 3 other books, one of which was a Dialectica of Aristotle printed in the city of Mexico in 1554. And this may be as good a place as any to observe that the first printing press set up in the New World was in the same city. And here we have a reproduction of History of William Penn's conversion from a gentleman to a Quaker. I am not sufficiently familiar with the title pages of books printed elsewhere than in England to say to what extent humorous or joking title pages were usual on the continent, but in England such titles were not uncommon. One such title occurs to me as applicable not alone to the year in which it was printed, 1642, the figure 6 was set upside down so the date reads 1942, but to England after the Great War. The title is The Virgin's Complaint for the loss of their sweethearts by those present wars, and their own long solitude in keeping their virginities against their wills. no one can long interest himself in the study of old books without discovering that a watermark frequently plays an important part in identifying a book, which, without it, might be difficult to place. There is curiously enough no article on this subject in the Encyclopaedia Britannica. A watermark is a device, an initial, a date, a trademark, or emblem woven into a sheet of paper during the period of its manufacture. It is made from a design, usually of wire, and set into the screen on which the paper pulp, later become a sheet of paper, is deposited. By holding the paper up to the light, it can be seen quite clearly, the paper being a trifle thinner where the watermark is. The study of the invention of paper, its manufacture and watermarks, is a fascinating one. Probably no man living knows more about it than Dart Hunter of Chillicothe, Ohio. He has written a fascinating and now scarce volume on the subject, entitled Old Paper Making, and the Watermarks of the Old Paper Makers. Incidentally, Mr. Hunter is the most interesting bookmaker in this, perhaps in any country. Speaking of himself and his work, he says, "I was reared in the midst of paper, type, and ink, and my earliest recollection is watching my father set type and print on an old hand press. I have seen through the press upward of 200 different books, but none of them ever pleased me." The Italian book printers of the 15th and 16th centuries had never been excelled. Their paper, even after 400 years, look at the paper of a Gutenberg Bible, shows a richness of tone and texture which modern paper makers have never equaled. So I went to Italy and studied the art of paper making. Then I went to Vienna and studied type design at the oldest institute of graphic arts in the world, and subsequently to London and studied tool making at the Royal Technical College. When I came home, I built a small mill with my own hands. Thatched it was with rye straw grown on my own farm, and equipped with miniature mill, with appliances such as had been used by 15th century paper makers. An old creaky wooden water wheel reduced the linen and cotton rags to a fibrous pulp, from which I made each sheet of paper separately in a hand mold. I next set up a small type foundry, and with no other tools or utensils than those that would have been used 400 years ago, I cut the letter punches in steel, struck the matrices in copper, and cast the type in a hand mold. When there was sufficient water to turn the water wheel, I was able to make about 75 sheets of paper a day. When there was no water, I made type. The whole undertaking revealed to me the interest there is in paper making and watermarking. The equipment, the mold, the letter punches, matrices, type, tools, and copies of the 2 books made from them are now in the Smithsonian Institution, Washington, D.C., and a label on the case in which they are displayed reads, "In the history of printing, these are the first books to have been made in their entirety by the labor of one man." Someone has written of this remarkable man that, although he will never become rich, he has the unique distinction of writing his name on an absolutely white page in the history of bookmaking. In connection with the printed book, there remain several matters to be touched upon before we turn over the printed sheet to the binder. We have referred to the colophon and the title page. There remains to be mentioned the half-title or bastard title, as it was sometimes called. This is a brief synopsis of the title, and immediately precedes it. It is usually placed in the center of the upper half of the page, and the page following it is always left blank. Practically all books now have half-titles, and no book is complete without one, and unless the volume is very rare indeed, no collector will place in his collection a book which, requiring a half-title, lacks it. Only the careful study of the signatures, the comparison of one copy with another, or the use of a carefully compiled bibliography will show what book has or should have a half-title. It is always to be remembered that book collecting is a sport, a game. One does not have to own a first edition of Johnson's Vanity of Human Wishes. One can lead a noble, upright life without it, even if one cannot be quite happy. But if one has it, it must be perfect. It was published in 1749 without a half-title, whereas his Life of Savage, published in 1744, has a half-title. In neither case does one know why or have to find out. I have used the word signature. A signature is a mark designed to assist the binder in getting the proper following of the page of a book. It was not, according to William Blades, an invention of the printer. It was, he says, quite as necessary for the scribe to mark the sequence of the sheets he wrote as for the typographer to mark the order of those he printed. For whether the page be written or printed, it is equally necessary for the printer to have a clue as to the order in which one page follows the other. At first the signature was written at the foot of every printed page. There is said to be an example of this in an uncut copy of Caxton's Roxburgh Sale in the Royal Library at Windsor, but after a time printed signatures came into use, and he further defines them as signs or marks placed beneath certain pages to distinguish the sections sometimes called quires, or gatherings, which they print. Today they serve another and most important purpose. They enable the careful bibliographer to ascertain whether or not any pages of a book are missing. The collation of a book, especially an old book, is by no means easy, and the art of collation should be and is mastered by every bibliographer worthy of the name. And here is a reason why one should always, if possible, secure a book in its original condition, in boards or cloth as issued. Some time ago, my friend Geoffrey Keyes asked me if I would collate for comparison some Jane Austens I had in original boards. I replied that I could not, but that I would get Mabel Zahn to do it for me. I sent her my books, and then for good measure, I borrowed a bound set, first two, and had them collated as well, with what result? Not one of my books in original condition was wrong. Not a single book in the bound set was right. I never attempt the job of collation myself. It is one of the many things you can well employ someone else to do for you. It is a part of the drudgery of the game, very like cleaning your own gun, which usually goes off and kills someone, especially if it is not loaded. May we not now assume that one book is safely printed and folded and collated in sheets or in sections or in quires, as the English say, and ready for the binder? I think so. So far we have done little or nothing ourselves. We have only defended, and not too exactly, some of the words we shall have occasion to use as we grow more skillful in this book collecting game. The first books were large, very large, but the world has never yet agreed upon just the name to apply to a large or very large book. Folio, elephant folio, double elephant, and atlas folio are loose terms and mean large, but how large? To be exact, one must state the size of the book in inches, or on the continent in centimeters. In an English periodical I read not long ago that it was high time papermakers all over the world got together and agreed on a standard size sheet, so that folded twice it would be a quarto, 4 times an octavo, and so on. Such a suggestion is absurd. This can never be done. For the size of a sheet of paper will, in the future as in the past, depend on many things, on the conditions under which it was made, its quality, and the particular purpose for which it is intended, to mention only 3. There is competition among paper makers, and the man who makes a desirable paper cheapest per pound will get the business. It is his business to make paper, not to give a book a name, indicating a size after it is printed and bound. No, if we are to have reform and intelligibility in the name of a book, meaning its size, publishers must agree that all books smaller than a certain size and larger than a certain size are to be known as, which you will, irrespective of the number of times the sheet which makes up the volume is folded. And after a time, it will be a long time, such silly names as though we now have will disappear. What idea does a cataloguer living in Exeter, England, intend to convey to a man living in Chicago by saying that a book is a small foolscap octavo? And what in heaven's name is the difference between an octavo and a crown octavo and a royal octavo? To call a quarto large or small does not help matters. What we must have is a lot of words, new words if need be, which will convey to a man's mind the idea that a book within certain limits of size, within a certain bracket, as our income blankets have it, is always called by a certain name. I am for whole volumes in folio. Shakespeare makes one of his characters exclaim, and he is, if I remember rightly, about to write a sonnet. This would be quite all right if the sheet on which the sonnet was printed when folded once, which is what a folio is, were originally no larger than the sheet on which I am now writing. But in general, sonnets when printed in folio find few readers. Our position in this country in regard to the names of the sizes of books is more difficult even than it was of the Our position in this country in regard to the names of the sizes of books is more difficult even than is that of the English. For we buy very largely from their catalogues, and they buy little or nothing from ours, and our nomenclature is entirely different from theirs. With us, a duodecimo is a book about the size of an ordinary novel. A book, say 7 1/2 inches high by 5 inches wide. An octavo is a book about 9 1/2 inches by 6 1/2 inches. Before me is a catalogue with an excellent one from the business of my dear old friend James Tragacus, in which a twin or a dos a dos binding, in this case a small testament and a prayer book bound together with their positions reversed, a binding difficult to describe but not unusual, is called a duodecimal. And here we have a reproduction of a dos binding. I know the size of the little nugget they are describing, for I have one exactly like it. It is bound in white satin and is elaborately embroidered in colored silk and metal thread. The unskilled collector ordering this article from the catalogue will be greatly surprised to receive a tiny book, only 4 inches high by 2 inches wide. Yet, Tragacus is only using the accepted English terminology, for the item in question came from the Huff collection and was shown some years ago at the exhibition of bindings at the Burlington Fine Arts Club, and it was there, as I happen to know, described as a duodecimal. So much for difficulties which inhere in the use of words intended to indicate size. And in this connection, publishers would be well advised to heed Dr. Johnson's saying, "Sir, no man read longs with a folio on the table. Books that you may carry to the fireside and hold readily in your hands are the most useful after all." We shall now concern ourselves briefly with printing. It is, I think, generally agreed that the first books printed were designed to look as though they had been written with a pen. How could it be otherwise? But it was only a short time before everyone who knew enough to read knew that the text or script he was reading was printed, not written. The printed book was not long looked upon as a miracle. Print shops sprang up everywhere, and books, sacred and profane, were printed. Artists of distinction began to design type that should no longer imitate writing with a pen, but should have a character of its own. Volumes, whole libraries have been written on the subject, some of them very beautiful, some very technical, and others that I find rather exasperating. For I believe that the first requisite of a printed book or a printed page is or should be its readability. The world goes round and round rather than on, and in some things, and printing is one of them. Many of the books printed before 1500 are as beautiful as, perhaps more beautiful than, any that have been printed since. We in this country do not, I think, sufficiently understand or admire the great typographical marvels of the past. In the first place, we see very few of them, except in the great public libraries, and it is chilling works standing with aching feet on the cold hard floors of museums, peering into glass cases at books, which too frequently give no clue as to what they are. For this reason, I think that an unimportant book on the table of a friend or in your own library is of greater interest than some great and priceless tome in a mausoleum, which is what too many libraries are. There are all sorts of libraries. The world's best is the British Museum, the world's worst and greatest too, no doubt, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. But books, not libraries, is my theme in general. Early printed books in English are very bad. Caxtons, if fascinating and priceless, are not beautiful. The first folio of Shakespeare, one of the great books of the world, is an ugly book, and almost as full of blunders as it is of beauties. Great progress was made in the printer's art in the 50 years following the appearance of the first folio, as it is always called. Then they began to print badly again, and just as printing became very bad indeed, new life was infused into the art by John Baskerville. I dare not retard the progress of this paper by any details of the life of this great printer. His edition of Virgil and his Milton, in the words of Macaulay, astonished all the librarians of Europe by their beauty, as did also his little Horace. Baskerville, in the phrase of today, put Birmingham on the map. His types are beautiful, and he was very particular in his important matters of paper and ink. Next in merit in England are the productions of the two Charles Whittinghams, uncle and nephew, the founders of the far-famed Chiswick Press, which still functions today, and no paper on printing would be even passable without reference to the great Oxford University Press. Founded in 1468 and still going strong, stronger than ever today, under the able direction of my friends Humphrey Milford and R.W. Chapman, the secretary thereof. We now come, in this hasty sketch, upon the name of William Morris, poet, artist, manufacturer, socialist, and last but not least, printer. By 1890, printing had again fallen from high estate. It needed for its revival just such a superb enthusiast as Morris. His achievement was a noble one. Towards the end of a busy life in 1890, he started the Kelmscott Press, which before his death in 1896 gave new direction to the art with which his name is inseparable. I bow to Morris as the man responsible for the renaissance of printing, but personally I do not much like his work. In his note on his aims in founding the Kelmscott Press, he says, "I began printing books with the hope of producing some which would have a definite claim to beauty, while at the same time they should be easy to read and should not dazzle the eye or trouble the intellect of the reader by eccentricity of forms in the letter." In his aim, he was not, in my judgment, entirely successful. His books are not easy to read, and they do dazzle the eye. A page of a book is not a picture, something to be merely looked upon. It is something that should be read. Readability is, after all, the supreme test of a page of text, and no one, I think, can long read a Kelmscott Press book with pleasure. In this respect, his followers and disciples have been more successful than the master, but this does not make the value of his work less. He worked with immense enthusiasm, designed several founts of type and an immense number of ornamental letters and borders and the like, and his supreme achievement in printing is his Chaucer. Is it? Authorities differ. I once heard a lover of books speak of it as vulgar, and I understood what he meant. It is in no respect a finer book than the Nuremberg Chronicle, printed by Koberger in 1493. Indeed, it is not so fine, for whereas the Chronicle was a natural flowering, the Morris Chaucer is an exotic. It is not a reflection on our judgment that the newer work is appraised at $1,000 books. Is it not, rather, a reflection on our judgment that the newer work is appraised at $1,000 and the older and much scarcer book at half that sum? Forget the price and compare the two books. It is not pleasant to say anything in detraction of Morris, and I am sorry that I am not through with the subject. But I must set over against him the name of another man who, in a humble way, began to work in the same field, if I may call it the same field, when the broad Atlantic lay between them. I refer, of course, to Thomas Mosher of Portland, Maine. It is curious to remember that the two men who have so influenced the style of the modern book, William Morris and Thomas Mosher, began their work quite independently of each other, and in the same year, 1890. It is now almost 40 years ago that I bought, immediately upon its appearance, the first Kelmscott Press book, The Story of the Glittering Plain. I bought it from E.D. North, who was then with Scribner's, because it interested me rather than because I thought it was beautiful. The book created a sensation at the time. It was hailed as a great achievement. Mosher's first book, whatever it was, created no comment. He, so far as I know, made no pronouncement. He merely went to work, and here we have Morris on the left here and Koberger on the right. So Morris, Koberger. He merely went to work, and with the limited means at his disposal, and they were extremely limited in Portland, Maine, in the early 90s, produced books which were beautiful in type and format, were easy to read and easy to hold. Moreover, they had this great merit. They were published at a price which put them within reach of all. Mosher did not prate about the art for the masses, or... I just knocked my camera. Did not prate about art for the masses or the beauty of democracy, and then produce books which only rich men could buy. But by the sheer force of his good taste and good judgment, he got the results he set out to secure. He was never a printer himself, but he had ideals and ideas, and he was able to impress them upon others. With the passage of time, he came to command the best types, paper and ink that could be had, and he used them like the artist he was. I have before me, as I write, two of the catalogues which, before the war, he used to issue annually. One is dated 1906. It is a slender catalogue of 68 pages. The cover is of dark blue paper, printed in an all-over design in dark green. Well, in a small panel in the upper left-hand corner is vermilion. In vermilion is the title, The Mosher Books, and the date. I have called it a catalogue. It is an anthology. Even more beautiful is the pamphlet issued 4 years later. It is now a booklet of 80 pages. The cover is old rose with the printing in 2 shades of the same color. Nothing could be more daintily simple than these brochures, which were intended for gratuitous distribution, but I have only suggested their greatest, their most enduring charm. Never before or since, I believe, has a man made such a delicate appeal to the reader and the book lover, with exquisite quotations in verse and in prose from every source under the wide and starry sky. He called attention to the literary merit of his wares, saying just enough about the type and size and binding to enable one to order by letter, for practically he sold only by mail. Occasionally, not often enough, someone went to Portland and asked where his shop or printery or office was, and practically no one knew. When he was at the height of his fame, known all over the world, someone went to Portland, registered at the hotel, and then asked where he could find T.B. Mosher. The clerk didn't know. He had never heard of him, but he would inquire after a time he returned, saying nobody knew. If he had ever lived in Portland, he must be dead. A prophet is not without honor, and so forth. Mosher's books have another merit, which one looks for in vain elsewhere. I refer to their literary quality. I don't think he ever printed a book merely because it would sell, although I have no doubt that many people bought his books because he printed them, and they never regretted doing so. His selective taste was as unerring as his knowledge of the practical side of his business. He made the best literature of all time and of all countries popular, if so be a book may be called popular, which in a nation of 100 millions sells only in hundreds. But mass production was not for him. Simplicity, what may be called readability, he kept ever before him. Whether a Mosher book was of large format or small, bound this way or that, one could always tell it at a glance, or could, until every printer and publisher in the country copied more or less his style. Morris has his disciples, Rudge, Rogers, Nash, Updike, Goody, but no less a debt is owed Mosher by those who may be called commercial publishers, and it is these who disseminate the taste of the nation. Indeed, it seems to me our printers owe as much to Mosher as to Morris. Mosher may have thought of himself as democratic. He would have laughed to have heard himself called an aristocrat of publishers, but he was an aristocrat in his mind and in his method. All of us who love books inside and out are and will ever be in debt to Thomas Bird Mosher. I feel no hesitation in speaking of him. I never saw him, and I have only one letter from him, and that was when 10 years ago I wrote in the Atlantic Monthly a few lines of appreciation of the work he was doing in the making of fine books. I am glad I did. I am glad I spoke while yet he was alive. After his death, to say what I thought would merely have been to join in the chorus. Some of the best writing brains of this country are functioning in the art of advertising. A cigarette advertiser has said, "There is a little Turkish in all good cigarettes, but some cigarette or other is all Turkish." In like manner, I should say that there is a little Mosher in all well-printed books, but the best printed books are all Mosher. Bruce Rogers remarked to a lecturer who had paid a tribute to Mosher in the Grolier Club one evening, "I would rather have done his work than mine." It was generously said, but Bruce Rogers can afford to let others look after his fame. It is secure, but there is, I fear, some danger, because Mosher was a publisher and not a printer, and because, as a publisher, he paid few or small royalties, that his real service to the book lover will be forgotten. Comparisons are always odious. There is glory enough for all. Both men are dead, but their work still lives after them. Both in England and in this country we have not one supreme, but many excellent printers. And this is as it should be. It is absurd to suppose that if you want a finely printed book, it must necessarily come from the press of so-and-so. There are many excellent printers, Edward Stern and Company, Incorporated of Philadelphia, for example, who did this book. Do not pose especially as art printers, but they do good conscientious work, of which this book is an example. The method by which it is printed, the aquatone process, makes the use of ugly, smelly, highly glazed inserts unnecessary for the printing of half-tone illustrations. It is the first, certainly one of the first commercial books to be printed in this manner, and will be far-reaching in its effect. The lines of Tennyson occur to me. Most can raise the flowers now, for all have got the seed. And the seed planted by William Morris in England and Thomas Bird Mosher in this country. And here, as we conclude this chapter, we have the illustration of an interesting sampler, which I think will pertain to the next chapter here, which is titled The Binding. And that will be for Wednesday.